Don't forget to subscribe. With today's rapid console war between PlayStation, Nintendo, and Xbox for dominance, one might agree that the consumer feels the impact more due to how games are so microwavable now. Only here for what feels like 1 month and then out for the next, forcing us to chase the trend or be left behind. And that's right, I'm talking especially to you 2K. Only changing the soundtrack and demanding $60 every year, you should be ashamed of yourself. Unless of course you choose to be a sponsor of this channel, then maybe I should be ashamed of myself for not seeing how much of a marketing genius you guys are. Anyways, the days of true co-op games are far beyond us. Days where you could call a friend over and tell them to bring over a controller and of course their memory card for a good game session is long gone. We're now living in a gaming world where I consider it a pay to play. And even with the payment, you still require hundreds of dollars of expensive equipment. And even then, the best you might get is the ability to just see them, but won't be able to truly team up and battle through waves of monster. Now, cue the drum roll. I say all this to bring up an interesting question. Was the Nintendo 64 the most iconic console? Did it leave the biggest impact in the gaming world? Or are we years from experiencing a true gaming console? Make sure to leave your comments and share your thoughts below. I'm always interested to see what viewers think. Of course, when I cover any console, I always like to take a brief moment to give their previous consoles their flowers, because without them, we wouldn't be here. In this case of the Nintendo 64, we have two as usual, coming from Gen 3 and Gen 4, being the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, released in 1983 and 1989. This console will come out to dominate the competition and even go on to hold on to its top spot for the few years into the Gen 5. Coming out in 1996, the Nintendo 64 was set out to revolutionize the game world, introducing 3D for the third time in history with the game Super Mario 64. The first and second place will go to a game called Battle Zone and 3D Monster Maze, coming out in 1980 and 1981. But competing with Mario, folks, it's never a good idea, as Mario been catching bodies since his first appearance in 1981 Donkey Kong, giving Donkey Kong a massive beating, saving the princess and going on 2 years later to get his own game. Also, an important thing to mention is that Mario was the first 3D game on a home console, while those other two were in the arcade. But along with Mario, there were one other game included with the release of the console, which was Pilotwings 64. Cruising USA was supposed to be the third game included, but got pulled due to not being up to Nintendo's quality standards. But come on, awesome cars, insane tricks, great music, it was an amazing game and probably one of the best games on Nintendo 64, so how dare you Nintendo? But aside from reintroducing 3D game, the 64 also introduced the analog stick as a form of movement, 4 controller port for multiplayer gaming, even having some of their games held as the pioneers for setting the groundwork for a few categories of games, and of course a diverse selection of colors and special edition for their console. The 64 was coming out swinging for a home run in all situations. With the Nintendo 64 making a late entrance into the Gen 5 war, it was set out to rival the newly launched PS1 launched 2 years prior in '94, and the Saturn by Sega, who still had the Genesis, but were pushed to quickly launch its new console by Sony's entrance. This would prove to be a mistake for Sega, focusing on the future while Gen 4 was still leading the market, but it seemed like it was a put up or shut up moment, and you could argue that they made the right choice. And if you have not, I would recommend you go watch the first video in this series on the Sega Genesis by clicking on the card in the corner of this video now, as doing so will give you a deeper understanding of Sega's path that led them out of this war in the long run. Anyways, the Nintendo 64 was the only console out of the three to stick with the cartridge as its main format of playing games. The Saturn had a backup slot to allow cartridge to play, but only as a backup. Now, there was a great reason for sticking with the cartridge, even though it was much more expensive to produce, ship, and compared to a disc, it was much more harder to store. But the cartridge had the benefit of loading games much faster. I mean, it was so fast that I personally cannot even list one game where I stood more than 5 seconds at a loading screen. I don't even remember a loading screen. But aside from being just fast, the cartridge also had a benefit of being much more difficult to replicate in the case of piracy. Although it wasn't impossible, even at the time, but I could imagine it was much more difficult. So why would Nintendo just stick with the cartridge then? Well, you could just say that Nintendo was one of the good guys back then. Because of all these benefits previously listed, it was obvious that Nintendo wanted to give the customer a better experience while playing the game, especially by not sacrificing quality to save a little bit of money. The Nintendo 64 will go on to receive a total of 393 games. Now it's kind of hard to imagine if that's even possible due to the fact when you say Nintendo 64, you mostly think from anywhere of 5 to 10 popular games, maybe 15. But that was mainly due to the fact that some were exclusively sold in Japan. But compared to its rival, the Nintendo 64 received only about half as much games as the next runner-up, which was the Sega Saturn, with PlayStation almost multiplying that by 4. Now you could say Nintendo was in a hot seat, but again this was due to the fact that they wanted to build a strategy of producing high quality game as opposed to high quantity over quality, which stems to the reason why most of their games will be responsible for being held as pioneers for some categories of games. One of those games being Super Mario 64, which is a diverse open world 3D platform game, being held as one of the most influential video game, and people would even argue that it started a whole new genre. But whether or not we can all come to agreement, we owe Mario a few things, like the free camera movement, the analog stick as a form of movement which offer a more freedom in the way you move your character as opposed to the D-pad, and the list goes on and on. But another game that stood out for setting the groundwork for another genre of game is GoldenEye 007, proving that it was possible to create an interesting and fun first-person shooter experience on a home console in both single-player and multiplayer, utilizing another thing that the Nintendo 64 stood out for, being able to allow up to 4 people to play at once, also introducing stealth elements and realistic gameplay and a context-sensitive hit location on enemies, adding an element that wasn't previously seen in video games. But anyways, the list goes on and on. Some other games that deserve honorable mentions are Legend of Zelda, Super Smash Bros, and I'm sure you could think of a few other names to add to this list. Before the release of PlayStation 1, Nintendo was the leader in the video game industry, smashing all competitors with the release of its previous 2 consoles and having majority of the audience on their side, so you could say that change was not something that they would welcome so easily, as there was no reason to. However, pride always comes before the fall. Although I've listed benefits of sticking with the cartridge, but on the other side, that would later play a key factor in their downfall, being that cartridge could not support larger sized games as CDs could, so sticking to this would mean that they would lose the support of third parties game developers, and especially game titles that could help them re-establish dominance in the game industry, like famously losing the Final Fantasy series to PlayStation. But other things that contribute to this was the lack of diversity in genre of games. And it's important to emphasize that although they were the pioneers of a lot of things, we must always remember that you can start something, but someone's always going to do their take on it, and it might be better. Like Sony taking the idea of the analog stick and making it a dual analog stick controller for their console that would later go on to have the rumble support, enhancing game experience. But all in all, the Nintendo 64 did phenomenal in its early years, going on to sell a total of 33 million consoles, while still holding on to the title for best-selling games, coming from Super Mario 64, selling a total of 11 million copies, followed by Mario Kart 64 with nearly 10 million, GoldenEye 007 trailing behind in third with 8 million, The Legend of Zelda at 7 million, Super Smash Bros at 5, and the list goes on and on, with nearly 50 games selling over a million or close to a million copies worldwide. But anyways, long gone but not forgotten. Make sure to comment any game that was your favorite on this console, and I'll catch you in the next video of this series. Don't forget to subscribe.